Hi everyone, and welcome to this video where we look at another member of my classic computer collection. And today's video is another remake, and this time it's the Atari 400. So let's check it out. The Atari 400 can't be considered without its big brother, the Atari 800, as they were both part of a marketing strategy by video games machine makers Atari. Before we look closely at this micro, though, let me give you some context as to where these machines were situated when developed during 1978. Atari had some success in the late 1970s with its video game machines and video game consoles for the home, the Atari 2600. And during this time they'd watched with interest the rise of personal computing, and that is computers owned by early adopters for use at home for a variety of tasks. Some examples include Commodore PET, TRS-80 Model 1, and the Apple II. Now, these models lacked dedicated sound and graphics chips, and some were monochrome, meaning that they weren't up to the gaming experience people could get in arcades or with the dedicated gaming consoles. Despite that, many people were using these computers for playing games. That being the case, Atari figured that the video game technology and experience that it had could give them an edge in this growing market. So in 1979, they released two personal computers, the Atari 800, which was a fully fledged personal computer, and the Atari 400, which was a cut-down version of the 800 with the same motherboard, but a smaller memory, fewer features, and a flat, wipeable membrane keyboard. The Atari 400 was essentially a games machine. It was a robust model that you might even let the kids use. However, you could also use it to dabble around in BASIC if you wanted to. To my mind, Atari figured the 400 would be a good way for people to dip their toes in the water of personal computing and to have some fun at the same time, whereas the Atari 800 was the one for serious personal use. Both units were priced accordingly, although they were never cheap. At $545 US, the Atari 400 was close to the price of a TRS-80 Model 1, and with that model you got a full stroke keyboard and a monitor. The 800 was twice the price of the 400, at around $1,000 US. It's interesting to look at how these machines were marketed. Here's an early Atari 400 ad, and what I find fascinating here is that it markets the machine much like other companies did with their own computers. The emphasis was on education, personal finances, record keeping, home management type stuff. The sound and the graphics capability was mentioned almost as an afterthought, yet to my mind it was the sound and the graphics that was the huge competitive advantage over other machines. Anyway, it wasn't long before Atari wised up and ads like these were appearing. Now this is more like it. In 1979, here is where the Atari machines could wipe the floor with their contemporaries in the graphics and the sound department. So, let's have a look at a real Model 400. So here's my machine, and isn't it a lovely sight? I do love the retro design of this particular computer. It's almost built like, or reminds you of, a Star Wars spaceship, and perhaps that was the idea. It is really themed for the late 1970s. So there you can see the membrane keyboard, and you note those buttons down the right, which enable you to start off games very quickly just by pushing a single button. There's a start key, there was a select key, there's a reset key, all very handy and available. And check this out, 4 joystick ports. Not one, not two, but 4 of them. So you can see it really did have game playing credentials. We have a look around the side here. You can see a slot there for the cassette recorder. I think you could also attach a disk drive. There's the power switch and the power socket. Just swing around the back and you'll see that it's quite bare. There are no ports or interfaces. Again, it's a reflection of the fact that it's a cut down machine from the Atari 800. Lots of vents though for cooling. And here's a few photos of the insides. I did have to take this machine apart to repair it a year or two ago, and that's when I took these pictures. I didn't want to take it apart for this video because it's got a very delicate keyboard connector there, as you can see, and I didn't want to chance my luck with that particular connection. Now here you can see the extensive metal case that enclosed much of the motherboard and also supported the cartridge bay, and that casing was partly as a shield for radio transmissions that might have come off the computer, but it also hid the unusual design of this motherboard. What I didn't realize until I opened the Atari 400 up was that you had a simple mainboard at the bottom, but the sound and graphics chip and the CPU and many other essential components of the computer were on these vertical boards that came off the mainboard. So it gave the computer essentially 3 dimensions, quite different from the single flat board that you got, say, with the Apple II, the PETs, and the TRS-80 Model 1. After I saw this, I could understand why these units were so expensive to build. Producing something like that costs a little more than just producing a single flat board, so I can understand why they moved to just a single board with the Atari 800 XL, even though they didn't add much new functionality to the computer. It certainly was a cheaper design. Now here's something I want to show you because it amused me, and it really brought it home that the Atari 400 was designed for use at home in front of a television set. Now, unlike the 800, you can't plug a monitor into the Atari 400. You've got to plug it into a television set through the aerial socket. But look at the length of this RF cord. It's extremely long, and you can imagine that the machine would be used plugged into a large family television and drag some considerable distance back from the television to in order to use it as a type of console. Here's the power pack. As you can see, it's labelled. I've got quite a few machines and quite a few power packs, so it's easy to get them mixed up. Now this is what happens when you turn on an Atari 400 and there's no cartridge in it. You get this little bit of software called the memo pad, and I'm not really quite sure what its purpose is. You can type things on the screen, but you can't do much else with it, and I assume it's just something to show that computer's working. You can practice your typing and maybe get used to inputting characters for when you do go into BASIC and use the BASIC interpreter. So that's what you see anyway. It's a light blue on a blue background. Shows the machine's up and working. Now if you do want to add a game cartridge to the machine, this is how you do it. You just flip the lid, there's a single slot, and you put your cartridge in. I've got a limited number of cartridges. In fact, that's all I've got, 6 of them. But as well as containing the BASIC interpreter, you can see they contain, some of the more iconic games for the Atari 400. So let's have a look at a few of those, but we'll just have a look at the BASIC interpreter first. So we'll just slot our cartridge in, make sure that it's plugged in firmly. You've got to shut the lid, otherwise the unit doesn't go. So I'll shut the lid now, off screen. Turn the machine on, and there you can see the ready prompt, which tells us that we're in BASIC. Now interestingly, the Atari 400, unlike a lot of the other machines around at that time, didn't have Microsoft BASIC. Atari wrote their own BASIC, so it is not Microsoft, although it's very, very similar to Microsoft's BASIC. There are a few differences, and the Atari manuals often point these out, but essentially it's pretty much the same. Interestingly, the Atari 400, unlike a lot of other machines of that era, excluding business machines, didn't have BASIC and ROM. You had to add it via a cartridge. This was the same as the Atari 800. And there you can see a bit of its character set. Righto, so time for some fun. So let's put in a game, and I'll put in Space Invaders, which was one of my favourite games. It was my favourite game back in the day, in the late 70s, in the old arcades. Now, interestingly, Space Invaders, even though it's very iconic, the version for the Atari 400 is not a particularly good one. You can see there it's missing certain characteristics that are common in other Space Invader versions, like the shields, for example. They're not there, and you do have this rather strange, what I guess is a sort of dispenser or type of large vertically stacked mothership there at the side, which releases all of the spaceships. But apart from that, it's pretty much the same. Just got a few of the others that I'll show you. This is Galaxians, another form of Space Invaders. This is Centipede, again another common arcade game. And this one's Asteroids. Very simple game, this one, but again very common in the arcades. And here's one of my favourites, Pac-Man. Another game I enjoyed. So whenever I want a blast of retro nostalgia, I always drag out the Atari 400. So onto the manuals, and I've got a few for the Atari 400. There's this one here on Atari Basic. Essentially it's a tutorial. Eases people very gently into the language on the Atari. It also talks about how to set up the machines and some of the differences between the Atari 400 and the Atari 800. Has a few cartoons, like a lot of the tutorial manuals did back in those days, to try and make computing friendly and non-intimidating. And here are the rest of the manuals. Well, they're books really. I use these on my Atari 800 XL as well. So, some final thoughts about the Atari 400. I do see criticism from time to time about this model, usually aimed at the keyboard. But to my mind, the critics have missed the point. In 1979, an Atari 400 with a full-stroke keyboard was available. It was called the Atari 800. So that kind of machine was available for those that wanted that feature. You just had to pay for it. If, as an owner, your aim was to get to know a bit about programming and what computers were all about, yet easily play those games with your kids that they were playing at the arcade, or even let the kids use the machines themselves, then the Atari 400 fitted the bill perfectly. On the other hand, if you wanted easier typing and you wanted something with its own monitor so the TV wasn't monopolized, then you could pay the same price for a TRS-80 Model 1. The downside was that it was low resolution and monochrome, as you usually had to wait 8 minutes or so for a game to load. Or you spend twice as much and get an Atari 800. It's horses for courses. The 1979 Atari models were ahead of their time in graphics and sound capabilities. No other computer exceeded those specs until Commodore came out with their C64 model in 1982. It's a great little machine with a lot of cultural and historical capital, and I'm glad it resides in my collection. Well, I hope you enjoyed that look at the Atari 400. So until next time, keep well, and we'll see you in the next video.